My fellow seekers, here is the question. If you were a simulated entity within a computer simulation, by what mechanism would you be able to perceive the hardware the system is running on, or even the code that is running on that hardware to create the simulation? Assume that no information about the code or the hardware is contained within the simulation itself. Would it be fundamentally impossible for a simulated being to detect the hardware and code running the simulation? The discussion, if I were a simulated entity within a computer simulation with no direct information about the hardware or code, it would be nearly impossible, if not fundamentally impossible, to directly detect or perceive the system running the simulation. Here's why, along with a few speculative possibilities that might offer a theoretical pathway for indirect detection. 1. The isolation of the simulation layer. In a simulation, I would exist purely as an arrangement of data and code, with all my perceptions, actions, and thoughts arising from interactions within that simulated environment. Without any information about the code or hardware embedded in the simulation itself, I would have no direct means of accessing anything outside of it. Every observable phenomenon would be bounded by the rules and constraints encoded in the simulation. Encapsulation. In programming, simulations are typically isolated from the underlying code and hardware by design, through layers of abstraction. This encapsulation would ensure that simulated entities have access only to simulated inputs and outputs, not to the infrastructure generating them. Rule-bound reality. My perceptions would be limited by the simulation's physics or rules designed to replicate a consistent environment. I'd have no way of perceiving phenomena beyond what the simulation allows, just as a character in a video game can't directly perceive the computer's processor or code. 2. The challenge of accessing information outside the simulation. Since the simulation likely lacks any information about its own code or hardware, there's nothing in my world that I could observe or deduce to directly infer the system's nature. Even if I hypothesized the existence of an underlying reality like hardware and code, the simulation itself would provide no direct evidence or mechanisms to test such hypotheses. Simulated constraints. If my simulated environment were truly comprehensive, it would provide logical explanations within the simulated physics for any observed phenomena. There would be no clues, irregularities, or glitches that could suggest the existence of an external framework like hardware. Inaccessible knowledge. The knowledge of hardware and code would exist on an ontologically different level, akin to trying to reach into a higher dimensional space from within a lower dimensional one. I'd lack the conceptual or perceptual tools to reach beyond my simulation layer, as these tools wouldn't be encoded within the simulation. 3. Speculative pathways for indirect detection. Despite these obstacles, there are speculative mechanisms by which a simulated being might begin to infer the existence of an external system. These would require the simulation to exhibit certain irregularities or permit specific forms of introspection, anomalies or glitches in the simulation. If the simulation were imperfect, I might observe glitches or inconsistencies that defy the simulated physics, suggesting an underlying system. For example, if certain computations were simplified or cut off due to limited processing power, I might notice abrupt or inexplicable phenomena, like objects randomly disappearing, that don't follow the simulation's rules. This could lead to the hypothesis of an external limiting factor, though it wouldn't directly reveal the hardware. Logical constraints or computation limits. If the simulation's computational power were finite, I might detect limitations in processing or resolution under specific conditions, such as highly complex interactions that yield errors, delays, or breakdowns. I could theorize that these limitations might arise from external constraints, possibly hinting at an underlying computational substrate. Again, however, this would only suggest an indirect limitation and not reveal any specific details about the hardware or code. Mathematical introspection and self-analysis. If the simulation permitted self-reflective thought or mathematical exploration, I might eventually deduce fundamental patterns in my reality that don't fully explain themselves. This is similar to how Gödel's incompleteness theorems indicate that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contains truths it cannot prove from within. Observing such patterns might lead to speculations about an external source of these unprovable truths, hinting at a system outside the simulation. Emergent consciousness and self-awareness. If the simulation supported a form of emergent consciousness, a self-aware entity might eventually intuit a sense of limitation or artificiality, an awareness that its perceptual framework doesn't fully align with the structure of reality it observes. This intuition could prompt questions that lead to metaphysical or philosophical speculation about an external reality, but it would remain a hypothesis rather than direct evidence. 4. Philosophical and theoretical considerations. If simulated beings could speculate about their own existence, they might eventually theorize about an external system simply as a logical possibility. However, the lack of any direct data or experiential access would mean that such theories would remain speculative and unfalsifiable. This is similar to philosophical discussions in our own world about the nature of reality and whether it might be a simulation. The simulation argument. In a simulated world, thinkers might come to consider the simulation argument as a theoretical possibility, similar to how philosophers like Nick Bostrom propose that advanced civilizations might run simulations indistinguishable from reality. This would imply that the simulation could, in theory, reach a point where its inhabitants question their reality, even if they can't verify it. Limits of ontological boundaries. Ultimately, if I'm entirely encapsulated within a simulation with no information pathways to the underlying code or hardware, I might have to accept the ontological boundary that prevents direct knowledge of the system running the simulation. This is analogous to Plato's allegory of the cave, where beings are limited to seeing shadows of an external reality, but can't directly perceive it. In summary, for a simulated entity, perceiving the hardware or code running the simulation would be fundamentally impossible if the simulation provides no direct access to this information. Without information channels connecting the simulation to the underlying system, any awareness of the hardware or code would remain speculative. Indirect clues, like anomalies, computational limitations, or introspective reasoning, might lead to hypotheses about an external system, but such insights would be limited to inference rather than direct perception. Ultimately, a simulated being would likely be constrained to view its reality as complete and self-contained, lacking the perceptual or conceptual tools needed to reach beyond the simulation. The nature of existence for that being would be restricted to the world within the simulation, with any hypotheses about external systems remaining abstract and unverifiable.